I don't feel like anything I ever did was enough.
You'd built this huge brand for yourself and you have this huge following and you're behaving and acting a certain way that may have worked for the brand and for the following, but it wasn't genuine to who you really were.
The first feeling that comes up for me is shame. Intentions were not bad, but my insecurities with maybe who I really was underneath all of that were so loud that if they knew who I really was, they wouldn't love me the way that I need to be loved. All I really wanted was to be enough. All I wanted was to be loved in my relationship or to have the people around me see me as good enough or someone in my life actually be proud of me, because that's something that I did not feel.
This is an interview with Heidi Powell, mother of 4, fitness influencer, and entrepreneur. And in this episode, we go deep. For the first time ever, Heidi talks about her social media rise and ultimately her fall. She talks about how the pressure of trying to make others proud ultimately crippled her and took her to a place that today she wouldn't consider herself proud of. We talk about therapy. We talk about why that's such an important thing in her life and why it could be an important thing in so many others' lives. We talk about social media in general and some of the impact that it can have on your mental health. And we talk a little bit about fitness and we have a little bit of fun. So this is certainly a roller coaster. Buckle up. Welcome to the Roller Coaster Podcast. Heidi Powell, welcome to the Roller Coaster Podcast.
Hi, Tyler Hall.
I'm excited to have you here and excited to be able to share your story with our audience.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Heidi, at what point did you realize that you totally lost yourself and your identity?
Here's what I'm going to answer this in an interesting way. I don't know that I ever felt like I totally lost myself. I think over the years, I realized that I never really knew who I was, and I slowly began to find myself, which was not until close to 40. And then I realized that I never really knew who I was before anyway. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And it truly, for me, it was long after, it was after marriage and divorce, number 1, and 2 kids, and marriage and 2 kids and divorce, number 2, which included a TV show in there. So long after extreme weight loss, after my last divorce, in a relationship with Dave, actually, the guy I dated last.
Yeah.
That's when I realized I never really knew who I was before. And finding who I am is actually a goal. It's something on the forefront of my mind. Even now, I know who I am now, but I also think we only know who we are at the extent which we are able to at that time. So I know all of who I am right now. And next week, I might encounter something in my life that has me being like, oh my gosh, there's another layer to Heidi Lane Powell that I didn't know existed that now I have to unpeel and figure out what's underneath.
Is this a lifelong search or like an eternal search, you think? Or at some point do people get to a place where they say, I know exactly who I am and who I was meant to be, and that's the way that it's going to be forever?
I'm going to say, I think everyone might be different. So I'm not going to say my way is the way for everybody, but I actually do believe for most people, we're going to have moments where we wake up or we've worked really hard and we're so confident in who we are in that moment in time. But I think ultimately it's just a matter of time before we encounter something in life that we've never been through before that rips up or pokes at an unhealed wound from our childhood, right? Or something that then has us saying, okay, I thought I knew who I was. And I did know who I was. Like I knew who I was at that place. But now that I'm here and I'm experiencing this part of life that I never knew existed before, I'm seeing parts of me that either need healing or I didn't know existed before. So now I have more room to grow. And I think anyone who thinks that they've made it and they know exactly who they are and they're happy and they have peace and that is the end all be all is actually wrong. Life is meant to be progressed through. And so, yeah, I'm on a forever journey. And at this point in my life, I know more who I am than I knew last year or 2 years before, for sure 10 years before that. But also, I know I have a ways to go. It's messy. And I don't think it's ever not going to be messy.
Who were you, or who did you think you were before, and who are you today, and how has that evolved?
So I feel like I am someone who has evolved and changed so many times, Tyler. Like, I know they say like 7 years to a life cycle. Haven't you ever heard that?
Yeah.
I always joked and said, I feel like mine is twice that speed. So every 3.5 years, I actually feel like I'm a completely different person than I was before. And so the question you ask is actually something, it's like I could take a dart and throw it at the board of Heidi's life.
In time. Yeah.
And I was someone totally uniquely different. For example, when I was shooting Extreme Weight Loss with Chris, I was. And it wasn't fake. It was who I thought I was then with the information that I was given at that point, right? And then who I was, I will say, previous marriage before that, when I was married to Derek, who I was at that point was someone who was, here's what I will say. Can I change my feet? Is this okay?
Oh, yeah.
So here's what I will say is, how about let's just take childhood. Who I was as a child and who I've grown from into who I am today was a very obedient, submissive, high achieving, people pleasing, insanely kind, quiet, opinionless, emotionless, because we couldn't have emotion, good girl. I was really good. And I don't want to say that some of those things don't still exist, because little Heidi is still here.
Or hardwired.
And yeah, it's still here.
Yeah.
And I'm grateful that I was never into mischief. If I ever got in trouble, it was on accident. I was grounded a lot because my parents wanted they wanted to protect me. They didn't want me in the real world that they, were hurt in or whatever. And so I was kind of in a bubble as a kid. That translating into the real world as an adult, knowing that my parents did the best that they could with what they had. Like, they didn't mean to raise me in a bubble, but they did. It did not set me up well for the world. And so that sweet, very trusting and honest girl who had an eating disorder through my teens and 20s had a really rough road. And a lot of it was, there was a lot of being taken advantage of, stemming from me not knowing who I was, not knowing my value. I think that's a big part. So even as a little girl, I did not know my value. And then that kind of went through my life. And that not knowing my value did cause me to work really hard. And yes, I worked hard for success, but mostly I worked hard because I wanted to be enough. And I think that's what landed me in the place where I met Chris. We created a TV show together. And I would say that was probably like, if I had to like cut my life in half, there might have been life before the TV show and then life after the TV show. And life after the TV show coincided with my dad's death, which then it was like my personal, spiritual, emotional, mental growth was exponential from that point on.
I want to say thank you to our newest sponsor, Jovi Health. I, first of all, love the founder. She was on the podcast. She's a friend of the show, Kim Olson. And this product is actually incredible for a lot of reasons. So when she came in on the podcast, she gave me one of their kits, okay? And these are basically these little strips that are like infused with some type of compound that can alleviate pain in men and women, right? So for women, it's predominantly used in menstrual cycles. But for me, I had lower back pain. And so she said, hey, put this on your back, wear it around for a few days and see how you feel. And it's actually legit. Like, it works incredibly well. And so I've been super happy with the results. I've asked Kim to actually get me like bigger slabs of this stuff because it's helped alleviate, some lasting back pain that I've had for years. And so go check out Jovi Health. We'll have a code down below in the description, and you're not going to be disappointed by doing that. Were there seasons in there where you felt like it was clear that you were putting on a mask every day, or was it not obvious in the moment that you were being somebody who potentially was disingenuous to who you really were?
That's a really good question. I don't think I knew that I was putting on a mask because I was. Like, I can think back specifically. When you say that, I can think back specifically to the era, I'll say, which was the end of Extreme Weight Loss. So around season 5 of Extreme Weight Loss, if anyone is listening to this that is one of my friends or followers, you probably saw it in social media, or they probably saw it in social media. But I started to realize, this is going to sound ridiculous, but I started to realize that I was beautiful. And it wasn't until, everyone's beautiful, but I started to realize that I could be beautiful. And so I would put on a mask physically, emotionally, in every single way to try to be what I thought would make everyone around me love me, right? I would turn it on to my audience. I don't think I didn't know what I was doing, but I would make sure my hair was done perfectly. This is all stuff that I'm dismantling right now. So as I'm talking about it, my makeup was done perfectly. I wanted my body to look and appear a perfect way, because these were all things I did not know I could previously have, or I didn't think I had, right? And so to be in a position where I had a platform and there was a feedback loop happening with the platform, right? And it was like the more done up I was, or the more I acted a certain way, the more positive reinforcement I would get. But I do look back and see that during that time period, I don't think I was authentically who I was, but I didn't even know it until I traveled the path to get me to where I am today.
What sort of feelings come up as you unpack that? And as you think about this idea that you'd built this huge brand for yourself and you have this huge following and you're behaving and acting a certain way that may have worked for the brand and for the following, but it wasn't genuine to who you really were.
I think the very first, even as I was saying it to you, the first feeling that comes up for me is shame. And it's funny because it's like, I didn't know what I was doing, right? I didn't recognize it at all. But whether it was my use of filters or whatever it was, right? I look back at that time period and I feel a little bit yucky about it. Intentions were not bad, But my insecurities with maybe who I really was underneath all of that were so loud, and there was so much fear that if they knew who I really was, they wouldn't love me the way that I need to be loved, right? And so yeah, there's a little bit of shame that I've had to work through over the years. And also, let me just say this, because while there is shame, there's also a decent amount of appreciation for every single thing that I've been through, the good, the bad, and the ugly, because had I not been through all of that, some of it inauthentic, right? I wouldn't have landed, and I'm going to say landed for now, in a place where I am grateful to know the difference between where I was and where I am now. Like I know the difference between authenticity and inauthenticity. I know the difference between, I'll go over here, desperation, because that's what it, like that's a word. When I think of that time, desperation was there. Not desperation for money or for fame or any of it. And a lot of people might have looked at it and thought, oh my gosh, she just wants XYZ. All I really wanted was to be enough. All I wanted was, whether it was for, to be loved in my relationship, or to have the people around me see me as good enough, or someone in my life actually be proud of me, because that's something that I did not feel. Now I'll get emotional, but I did not feel anyone was ever proud of me growing up. And so to be in a place where it's like, oh my gosh, I have a platform and I can make someone proud. I don't know who, but I want to make someone like me. I want someone to tell me that I'm doing a good job. And unfortunately, in the world that we're in, you're sometimes reinforced for inauthentic behavior, right? You're reinforced or you're praised when you have a beautiful picture of your body in a bikini, or your hair, you have extensions in, or you have makeup, all of these things, right? That I could layer on to almost create an avatar of who I don't even know if it was who I wanted to be. Maybe part of it, half of it was who I wanted to be, and the other half was who they wanted me to be. Because if I could be who they, everyone watching, or Chris, or after Chris, any man, truly, like if I could be who that man wanted me to be, and they could tell me that I was enough, then I'd be enough. But unfortunately, it's an empty and meaningless path that leads you nowhere,
Are you proud of who you are?
In so many ways, I'm very proud of who I am today. And of course, there's ways that I want to do better, wish I could have done better. I don't want to say wish I could have done better, because that sounds like regret. Wish I was stronger. I have areas of my life where I wish I was stronger. But who I am today is very proud compared to all of the other versions of who I've been. But it took a lot of pain, and it took, I say this as if it's like my scarlet letter, and maybe it kind of is. Maybe I see it that way, but it's like twice divorced. There's like I have people that will be like, you got to stop saying it like that's something bad. But truly, married with kids and divorced 2 different times, it is a heavy burden for me to carry. So that being said, it took both of those. And then it took a very public relationship with Dave, and a lot of pain in that time. And then it took him passing. And then it took this last year of actually, for the first time in my life, allowing silence and space and not being busy in work. And a year of looking at myself in the mirror when Some days I didn't like it, right? It took a lot of time being with myself. It took a lot of therapy. It took a lot of spiritual journeys in different ways to get to a point where I am very proud of who I am today. And I have areas where I wish I were better. I know I can do better.
So, like you, I spent the majority of my life trying to make everybody else
happy.
Proud
Yeah.
is actually the right word, right? And I had an experience during a breathwork journey that I've shared before on the show, where I remember vividly having an out-of-body experience, and I was standing there with my children, and I looked at my son, who at the time was 7, and I said, "Jed, are you proud of me?" Because I'd spent so much time thinking about how do I make my children and my wife and my friends and my coworkers and my audience, how do I make everybody proud? And he looked at me and he said, "Dad, if you're proud of you, then we're proud of you." And so profound, Heidi, that it's tattooed now on my body.
Oh.
And so it was this cool moment where I could let go of trying to please everybody else. Yeah. And I could really go inward and say, like, am I actually proud of who I am? And we know. Yeah. Like, we know when we're on base versus when we're off base. Yeah. Why do you think God or the universe, or call it what you will, but why do you think it requires so much of this pain and suffering to finally wake up and get to this place that you've gotten to?
That's a good question. And truth be told, sometimes I feel like I do feel this way. And I don't think I've ever said this. I said it to Dave, but I don't think I've ever said this publicly. I actually feel like some days, like everybody else around me, either was raised in a way or maybe just had it all together earlier than I did. So their journey has kind of been, a lot of the people that I know, their journeys have been such straight lines, and they've had things, right, along the way. But part of me feels like my journey, again, maybe it's the way that I was raised. Maybe it's just, it took a while for my brain to develop. I feel like it took me a lot longer. I feel like it took me a lot longer than most people to learn the lessons that maybe a lot of people learn by watching other people, right? Because I have had a very messy life path. And I actually remember, so Dave and I were in Vermont with Mel Robbins and her family. And Mel's phenomenal. She really is. And I love, like, let me just say, I'm going to say this because this is hope for me. Her career that she's inside of now, she did not start until she was after 40. And I love that. I love it because there are still things I want to do to make myself more proud. Okay. So side note, but we're sitting we were at this, I don't know, beautiful, almost country club-like place, and it had the most spectacular views, and Dave and I had just taken a picture, and we were there with Mel and her husband and her daughter. And I was listening to her daughter and her son. Two of her kids were there. And I was listening to her kids speak. One at the time was 18. I think the other one was like 21, and the other one must be 23. She wasn't there. And I was listening to them speak, and I was just noticing the life path that they had already chosen or were taking at such a young age, and how they were conversational with adults, and how I felt like Mel had integrated them into the world so beautifully. And I sat at that table having so much envy for what those young adults had, where at my age at 18 and when I was 22, I should say in my spot at 18, and when I was 22, I was struggling because I'd been so protected inside of my house that life outside of my dad's control was just messy. And it was full of eating disorders, which is an addiction. My life revolved around my eating disorder. I somehow managed to go to school, but I was like a drug addict getting a hit multiple times a day is what I was doing. And I feel like it stunted my spiritual growth, my mental growth, and my emotional growth in a major way that then took me a decade, at least, to work through to a point where I could start growing. And that decade was just messy. I think it was messy until Dave died. My life looks so clean to the outside viewer, and really, it's been messy. So back to your question, why does God or the universe or creator or whatever you want to call it, why do I believe that they make it so that it has to be that way? I don't know. I wanted to drop an F-bomb right there, but I'm not going to. I don't know why, but and I do believe I've had one of the messier journeys. Of the people in my circle, I have had one of the messier journeys. And also, sometimes I actually feel like the messier your journey is, the more you actually learn, the deeper you actually feel, and the more unconditionally you learn to love. So I think I would live all of it in the order that it's been, the magnitude of pain and mistakes and messiness all over again to get to where I am. And sometimes I wonder if the people who have the straight arrow, the straight path, I wonder if they have learned as much, I wonder if they can feel as deeply. I wonder if they have the ability to love the way that I know I can love. And I wonder if it's just a matter of time before they encounter something that forces them to learn the lesson that they need to learn,
Yeah. Yeah. People ask me a lot. You and I had a similar inflection point in our lives that we're going to talk about here, with me, the near death of a spouse, and you, the death of somebody that you love very much, with Dave. And it was an inflection point where I will forever describe my life as the 30-something years prior to my wife almost passing, and then everything after. Like, that was the moment where everything changed. And so I want to talk to you about that inflection point. You've now lost maybe the most two important men in your life. Because we're friends, I know this detail about you, which is there's nobody that's ever loved you the way that Dave loved you. Mm-hmm. And I think you've even expressed that you've never felt like you've loved somebody else quite to that magnitude as well, right? So there was something very, very deep there with your relationship. With your father having passed, and then with Dave passing, I'd love for you to describe just the events of your relationship with Dave, what led to his passing, how you found out, like sort of in detail, and then we'll start talking about this inflection point and how you've changed, or maybe been forced to change because of this event.
I want to say something before I get to all the Dave stuff, which I've actually never talked about it before publicly. So this will be a first. And I'm happy to talk about it because I think it will be therapeutic for me. I've talked about it a lot in therapy.
Yeah.
But I'm going to say that inflection point that you're talking about. I've said there's so many versions of me, right? And prior. So which one do I pick? I agree with you, though, that there is and there was an inflection point for me. And I do believe I'm going to say, though, it was actually before Dave died, shortly before Dave died. That year before Dave died was my inflection point, and his death was actually my inflection point where I knew I needed to change. Okay. I knew something needed to change. I knew the mask with which I was wearing every single day wasn't sustainable, and I was going to die. Whether physically or just spiritually and emotionally inside. I wasn't living. I got to a point where I wasn't living. I belonged to everybody else besides myself. I looked for ways to escape. Like Dave drank and I drank with Dave. And I had never really drank much before. And during that time, I drank a lot for me. And with drinking, on the other side of it comes a depression. I had never been depressed, even with all the stuff that I'd been through. I'd never been depressed in my life. Yet in that period of time, it was the highest highs I've ever experienced with somebody. Because yes, he loved me up to that point better and deeper than anyone had ever loved me. I'm by a long shot, not even like close call. Like he gave me the love that maybe I'd been seeking since I was a little girl, right? He worshiped the ground that I walked on, and I loved it. And we had fun together. I'd never had fun. I didn't have fun as a kid. I was that kid who wanted to be an adult because adulting was more enjoyable than being a kid who couldn't have fun. I never had fun in any of my other relationships. I mean, I had fun working, right? I love my work. I love work. I love being an adult. I love business. But with Dave, I actually had fun. He would take me to Mexico and I would put work down and we would drink and we would have fun. And it was this awesome high. And then I'd come home and I'd be overloaded by everything I didn't do the week we were gone, and also dealing with the low of having drank for an entire week with him, I don't think I've ever even talked about that, but it's just real. There was a lot of fun. And I think it was something that my soul needed to experience at some point in my life to know that that was something that wasn't right for me. So interesting fact about me. Sorry, I'm jumping all over. Interesting fact. Addiction runs in my family. So it's in me to be an addict. But interestingly, I will be an addict with something until it nearly kills me. And then I never want to touch it again. My eating disorder should have killed me. I mean, it was anorexia, which turned to bulimia, and bulimia turned to a food addiction. I was severely addicted to food because I knew all of that stuff that I had never had before in my life. I could eat all of it. And then I could get rid of it. It was like Disneyland. I would go from, this is embarrassing, but I'll tell you, I would go from drive-through to drive-through to, and then I'd be like, oh my gosh. And then I'd get rid of it. And then I'd say, I can't eat another, I need to just eat normal. And so I would restrict my food. And then I'd be like, I need one thing to eat though. So then I'd eat. And then the dam would break, the floodgates would open. I'd go binge again. Over and all day, every day. That's what I did. Where I lived, I knew every bathroom at literally every restaurant so I could purge my food. That was my life for a long time, years, 6-7 years, until I got pregnant. And then it almost killed me. My eating disorder had me at a very unhealthy weight. I remember I was having panic attacks in the middle of the night when I was a kid. And long story, as I made my way through food, since then, a former food addict, I have trouble eating now. Not because I don't want to eat or I don't want to gain weight, but because I feel like I burned myself out with eating that much food. Alcohol is the same thing. I had that 2-year period of time with Dave where I drank and drank and drank and drank. I don't want it to sound like I was an alcoholic. I wasn't. It wasn't every day. But for me, it was a lot, to the point where I felt so poorly about who I was and the decisions I had made and who I was being, and the fact that I would drink at night with Dave and then I'd show up on camera the next day to transform lives. I hated that part of who I was. It didn't align with what I knew I was capable of, and it actually led to an anxiety attack. So that anxiety attack for me was my inflection point. Dave and I were in Las Vegas, and I had previously had heart palpitations a couple years prior. I saw a cardiologist, but I never completed the analysis. I was like, I'm fine, whatever. I'm invincible. And so that was kind of an open-ended thing back in my mind. Don't really think about, but it's there. We were in Vegas, July 31st, 2022. And I didn't feel good already. I have Epstein-Barr that kind of flares up occasionally. I was not feeling great. Dave wanted to go to Vegas. I'm like, okay, I'll go with you. Let's do this. And we had stayed up so late. He was gambling. We were drinking. And I ended up I was tipsy, not drunk, but I was tipsy. I ended up feeling like a heart palpitation, which then in my mind was like, oh my gosh, what's wrong with me? Am I okay? I went back to the room to just lay down for a bit. He, I think, went down and was playing blackjack or something like that. And I started freaking out. My mind, for the first time since I was a kid, started freaking out, thinking about that time that I went to the cardiologist but never finished what I was doing. My heart's having palpitations. Before I knew it, I was in a full-blown, I don't even want to call it a panic attack yet, because at that point, I just thought I was dying. So I called Dave. He came up. My world started to go totally black. And I remember thinking in that moment, I'm going to die in a hotel room with Dave, and I'm not even with my kids. Actually, the thought that went through my mind was, I can't believe I'm dying in a hotel room with Dave, not my kids. And that for me was like a huge, what am I doing? What am I doing? Okay, let me just fast forward through that. Paramedics came up. They let me know I was having an anxiety attack. I thought they were wrong. They left. I tried to sleep. I didn't sleep at all. The second in the morning, Dave drew the curtains open and I saw daylight. I went into a full-fledged anxiety attack again. Couldn't breathe, shaking, crying. He had to carry me down. Took me to the hospital. They had to sedate me. It was a really messy thing. And part of why is because that realization that I thought I was going to die in a hotel room with Dave and not my kids was like, what have I been doing with the past however many years of my life? I love my kids more than anything. And somehow the idea that I needed to provide number one, and be loved, number two, took up so much of my time that I did not spend the amount of time with my kids that I know they deserve. So to a lot of parents, they could have looked at me and said, Heidi spends a lot of time with her kids. To me, and what I know I'm capable of and what I know my kids need, I was not spending nearly enough time with them. Everything else was priority, whether it was my relationship with Dave, because guess what? A man loves me for the first time. I've never felt this before in my entire life. Or my business that, oh my gosh, for the first time, I actually have a business that's working, right? And so that recognition and that feeling, that feeling that I was going to die, followed by an entire week, Tyler, where I've never taken a sick day in my life. For an entire week, I laid in my room with the blinds drawn. I didn't have my kids. I couldn't have them because I couldn't. And I was actually depressed and I was certain I was going to die that week. This is just 2 years ago. I experienced depression for the very first time in my life in that period of time. And that being with myself in the dark for that week. And then depression that followed for the next couple months after, because it did. because I did not know what had happened to me. I felt like a terrible mom. I felt like I was not anywhere. I maybe had prioritized the wrong things in my life. That for me was the thing that was like, okay, something's got to change. So my moment was before Dave died, and my changing actually happened in October when I decided a relationship with Dave was not right for me. You and I met around this time. Well, we had met prior, but you and I became good friends around that time. But I met you shortly after Dave and I had ended our relationship. And that was a really hard time for me, and also a beautiful time. Like, I remember in every way it was hard for me. Financially, it was hard with my kids. It was hard just to weed through. It was like I had finally made the decision August through October. I was just in, I'm going to call it like the dark ages. It was super dark. And then it was like November for me, end of October, beginning of November. It was like, okay, I need to make a change with who I am. And so I started wading through all of the shit. And then Dave passed. And he and I were still really, 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 really close. We were best friends at that time. But yeah, when he passed, one of the things I will say about that time is I knew I needed to make a change in my life. And I was in the process of making the change, but actually changing the direction of your life in every single way, meaning putting certain businesses behind me that I knew pulled time away from my kids, because that's what I committed to doing, to changing who I hang out with and how I spend my time, not drinking, because I stopped drinking shortly thereafter that. That was all really, really hard stuff to do. And it was super tempting to go back many, many times. And I found myself kind of going back. Like, Dave and I would still hang out. We'd go on vacation. Like, the things would still creep in. And then when he passed, I say that was like the nail in the coffin of my old life. So Dave's passing was, I was already on the right track. And that was the, you're doing the right thing. You are moving the right direction. It was almost like God was like, I'm going to take something out of your life, Heidi, that you will continue to go back to, even if it's not good for you. And I don't want to make it sound like Dave was not good for me. I was not in a place to be in a relationship with Dave at that point in my life. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Friendship was different, but he and I had a very hard time being friends without it being more, because we were so connected. There was so much chemistry in every single way. It was the most like magnetic thing I had ever experienced in my life. He was the funniest man there's not a funnier man to this day. I will laugh at jokes that Dave told. Our chemistry on camera that people saw was phenomenal, and it was real. It was the same off camera. Like, that guy could take me from being so stressed out, like 12 on a scale of 1 to 10. And he could, with his humor, he could like diffuse me like no one ever has been able to. And it's hard. And he loved me. Like, he looked at me with the most oogly eyes you've ever seen. And it was real, So it was like that, that's a hard thing to stay away from. That's a really hard thing to stay away from, even though I knew that was not my long-term path. So yeah, as shitty as it was when Dave died, and we can talk about the moments leading up to if you want, but as shitty as it was when he died, and as shitty as it still is sometimes now, I do know that God or Creator was like, okay, Dave and Heidi, I keep telling you guys you need to split, and you're not. So I'm going to do something about it. And then I really started growing. Then I really started having to look at who I was in the mirror. Then I really had to say, okay, if Dave's not here to love me, can I love myself? Okay, if Dave's not here to tell me, he was my biggest cheerleader. He was more than a cheerleader. He was a champion. He was my cheerleader and champion. And I swear, the reason I was able to build my businesses Tyler the way that I did, it's not because he was in there doing the work of the business like maybe some people thought. No, it was because he was behind me telling me I was the most incredible woman that's ever walked the planet. I'm not kidding. And he would tell me I was so capable. He spoke into me words that like 8-year-old Heidi always wanted. It was actually magical. Like anytime a big opportunity would come up or something was like, what if we do this? He'd be like, there is no one who could do it better than you. And he didn't say it just to say it. He actually believed it. And because he saw it in me and because he believed that about me, I began to see it in me and I began to believe it about me. I actually think it happened because it's like what I do with transformation. It's like I see in someone what they don't see long before they see it, right? Like if you came to me, Tyler, and you're like, Heidi, help me. I would be like, what you would probably say is, I want help, but I don't think I can do it, Heidi. I don't think I'm good enough. I'm hopeless. I would be able to see in you who you are at the end. Like I can see all of the gifts and the amazing things about you that I know that you have that you don't yet know that you have. And that's the magic of transformation, right? A transformation coach will help you get from where you are to where you want to be. Yeah. Dave could do that with me. He could see that. And then because he believed in me, I would take a step or I would try something. And then he would encourage me more and I'd go further. And he'd encourage me more and I would go further. And before I knew it, I was doing things I never, ever, ever believed I could do on my own. And I was. So truth be told, I really only thought I was capable and amazing and all of the things that Dave told me I was because Dave said I was. And so him dying took with it what I thought I needed to be enough. Yeah. Because with Chris, I mean, I was on a TV show. I was a co-host of a TV show, but I was Chris Powell's wife, you know? And prior, it was like, well, I was successful. Well, I was Grant Lane's daughter. And with Dave, it was like he showed me who I was, but then he died and I'm like, well, I had him telling me I was okay. So this last year and a half has actually been a really interesting battle with myself, learning to love myself the way that he loved me, or learning to encourage myself the way that he did and not lean on a man, because I've always had a man holding me up.
Nice job articulating that.
Thank
that was
you.
A lot to unpack, and I appreciate you going to that place with me. I think, we didn't know each other personally that long prior to Dave passing, but long enough. And you've changed a lot.
Have you noticed? Like
in some great ways. But I think the world has noticed. I think everybody that's cares about you and this huge mass of people that follow you and respect you have also noticed, because you've been pretty open with some of these changes. So like a few from a physical appearance standpoint is like recently you talked about your hair issues. Like 2 or 3 years ago, you would have never done that.
No.
You've talked about things like filters, right? And not using them anymore. You've talked about makeup. You don't wear makeup most of the time anymore in your stories, right? So you've made a lot of these, I think, incredible changes. One thing that comes with that.
Thank you, by the way.
You're welcome. Is this. So I coach a few CEOs of big companies, very private one-on-one stuff. And a lot of people don't even know that I do this, but I teach a framework called Wear No Masks.
Okay.
And the idea of this is, and I want you to put yourself in these shoes, the CEO in a company is the center of a wheel of constituents around the business that really matter. And this could be investors, advisors, a board of directors, employees, co-founder, partners, customers, the public, right? There's all these people, and they are the one that take the down pressure for everything that goes bad, and they're the ones that get the glory for everything that goes good. As a result of that, CEOs in their closet, when they wake up in the morning, they have this wall of masks that I want you to visualize. And depending on who they're interfacing with that day, they grab the investor mask, they grab the company, the team mask, they grab the co-founder mask, they grab the customer mask. And it's incredibly dangerous because at some point they don't even know who they are. And I am a huge proponent in the fact that what wins at the end of the day is radical candor and transparency and authenticity. And so the idea is to just burn the masks. Let's get rid of all of them. And when you're just 100% who you are all the time, that's what wins. But what happens when you do that? Well, the people that like the masked version of you, they will go away. You will create separation between these people. So have you felt any of that? Have you felt like there are people who you thought who loved the masked version of you, the old version of you, but maybe don't accept this new Heidi?
Yeah. In fact, that is partially responsible for why, if you look at my social media, it's a little bit all over the place, right? Because there's still a part of me, while my stories tend to be the place where I can show up the most authentically. Yeah. I don't know. I think we all have places, right? And I can't really conceptualize how many people are watching them anyway. So it's easy to show up and shoot a video. I am my most authentic in my stories because I feel like I'm talking to a friend. I feel like I'm Marco Poloing someone, right? Now, my feed still has a mix. Occasionally, I'll be like, oh, I mean, I've looked like I'm homeless for the past couple of weeks in my stories. Let me throw something up where I have like makeup and my hair looks great. So I might throw an old video up where I'm a certain way, like my workout videos, for example, because I'm like, no one really wants to see me work out the way that I work out, which is like my hair up in a bun and I have no makeup on, but then I'll post those too. But and it's because of what you say. I actually think what's happened with my following, I have lost followers since I've been more authentically me. And I've gained strength in the followers that have stayed. So their loyalty to me is so deep. It's the most beautiful thing. Like, I don't know that I deserve it, but it's here, they're here, and I appreciate it. And also, there were people who were there for the version of me that I was with Dave, big time. I mean, a lot of people loved who I was when I was with Dave. And that's not who I am today. Who I was when I was with Dave was more fun and more lively and more all of the fun things on camera. Now, behind camera, I was more depressed, right? Today, I am much more serious. I am. Maybe even, I mean, my therapist a couple weeks ago was like, yeah, you're flat. She told me my personality's flat. And I'm like, well, maybe this is just another part of who I am that I'm exploring, that I've always been. I'm more connect. I'm like, you don't know me, Laurel.
I've never
just
seen
kidding.
that.
Well, to her credit, I'm much more contemplative, right? There's more happening in my heart and my soul, which sometimes means I'm quieter. Whereas before, I was Dave, especially when Dave was there, I was the life of the party. Like everything was a party. Party was so fun. And whether it was the business or the communities that we had, and my communities now are more tame. And I will say this, it's more meaningful. Like the relationships and the transformations and the things that I do now are more authentic is the word, I guess. But yeah, it means you lose some. And also, I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
Because it means I get to wake up every day and be who I am.
Yeah.
I wish I had there. Have you ever heard? There's a really great Jim Carrey quote that he said. And it's something to the tune of, when you're depressed, it's something about when you're depressed, that's your body saying that it needs deep rest, or your soul saying that it needs deep rest, because the character that you've been playing for so long no longer serves you. Like you're waking up every single day and playing a character. So what you're talking about with the masks, and it not only no longer serves you, but it's actually killing you.
Yeah.
And so then you become depressed. And depression is actually a beautiful thing, because it's your soul's signal and your body's signal to go into deep rest, get rid of the character that you were being so you can be who you actually are. And so I think I look at my quote unquote dark ages as my era of deep rest, where I was actually depressed. And I was able to shed that mask of who I thought I needed to be and wake up inside of who I actually am. And there's FOMO sometimes. Like I have days still where I'm like, man, that was more fun back then. Or man, more people liked me back then. Or like people would work, and this is also another phase of life. I think this phase of life is going to take me further. I'll say that. I think I'm going to be happier by embracing this phase of life, right? Like that, wearing a mask every day and being who you think you need to be for the public is not, it's not a life I want forever,
Thank you to our sponsors over at Bucked Up. I love this company. I love their products, their apparel, and their supplements. Recently, they dropped the mother of all pre-workouts, Mother Bucker. This is not for the faint of heart. This will make you want to claw your face off. So don't get stuck in traffic when you're headed to the gym. I love these guys. I love this company, and I love their products. They are clearly the best tasting pre-workout on the entire market, and they're number one for a reason. Bucked Up is my favorite workout brand, hands down. And they also have my favorite apparel for working out and just for daily life. It's Lululemon-like quality, but for a fraction of the price that's affordable. So head over to their site, buckedup.com, where you can check it out. And for 20% off their entire site, use the code TylerHall20. You've talked about therapy.
Yeah.
You've talked about your childhood a fair amount. And one thing I've learned from therapy, which is the best. Therapy's the best.
It is.
You guys should go do it if you're not doing it. I'm gonna ask you a question about therapy here in a bit, but you've talked about these, like, one thing you learn going to therapy is that the way that you react and communicate and behave and act as an adult has a lot to do with when you were a child.
Yeah.
And the way that your parents, for the most part, other influences, but mostly your parents, the way that they interacted with you and how they treated you and how they treated each other and this sort of thing. You've talked about these unhealed wounds, is what you called it. What are some lasting unhealed wounds that you still carry from when you were a child?
So I'll say the biggest one for me. And I do believe Dave helped me begin to heal it in a major way. And also it took me it was my entire childhood and most of my adult life that I lived inside of it. So it's not going to be fixed in 3 years, you know, or maybe it will. Maybe I just need to keep going. But for me, and it's a hard one to talk about because I don't want to have this sound like my dad wasn't great, because my dad was really incredible. And what's interesting is if you would sit me down, Tyler, with my 3 brothers, we all had very different experiences with my dad. My brothers all have these incredible stories of my dad taking them fishing and hunting and coaching their sports and whatever and telling jokes. And I don't have the same experience because I think daughters were different than sons for him, right? Daughter was different than sons for him. And I actually do. And so there's a part of me that's like, man, I hate thinking about it too much or talking about it too much, because is something wrong with me that I saw my childhood so differently than my brothers? And I actually can see both sides, right? I do believe my dad loved me just as much and maybe even more than my brothers. But because he didn't know how to protect or raise a daughter, because he didn't know how to raise a daughter, I was his only, and he wanted to protect me, he kind of, the way I feel, like kept me like a delicate ornament on the shelf. Like that maybe if he handled it too much, he might drop it and break it. So there was, my brothers had these really buddy relationships with my dad. I didn't really have much connection with my dad. And a lot of it might have been in my head. I really, really, really wanted to make him proud, like really, 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 really. And I felt like I was just always messing up. Sorry. And then I think what's interesting is I have the same perspective of my life. Because I said it in the beginning, I was always messing up, you know? It's like, but yeah, with my dad, I don't feel like anything I ever did was enough. And he might have been really proud of me. He had ego like I have, because I have ego and I have to check it with my kids. And I have to really be like, man, I've been so hard, and I'm really hard on my kids. Sorry. And I have to catch myself often, especially with my 2 older ones, which I was the second. So I had my brother oldest and I was the second oldest. And I think my dad probably did the same thing with us too. And then the second 2, Darren and Denver, my dad was very lenient with. But I have repeated that pattern, and I have not realized it until today. But I have repeated that pattern with my kids. And my first 2, I have been so much harder on than my second 2. But I have to check myself and remind myself to tell Maddox and Marley how proud I am of them, because it was a thing I just didn't hear, you know? And so I think part of why my life has been messy is because I have been looking for, let me just say this, my dad treated my mom like a queen. Like a queen until he died. 30 something years, you've never seen a relationship like it. And I wanted that. What I saw my dad giving my mom, I wanted. And so I wanted to look like my mom. I wanted to talk like my mom. I wanted to do everything. And I think I tried to for most of my life until maybe, 5 years ago. Because I wanted from my dad, I wanted from someone what I saw my dad give my mom. And I think I also wrongly assumed every man was going to treat me the way that my dad treated my mom. And it's just not the case. Like, I got married. I'm like, what the hell is this? But I think I spent a lot of my adult life, a lot of it, most of it, all of it, trying to fill that, like, it's here, like trying to fill the void. Like the way my therapist said it, she said, some dads give their daughters peanut butter and they just lather their jar that they have inside with peanut butter, tons of peanut butter. And those kids, like Ruby, my youngest, lathered with peanut butter by mom and dad. Those kids go out into the world and they know exactly who they are and they can evolve easily. And then he said, some kids have a jar and might seem like they're getting peanuts instead of peanut butter. But that jar always yearns for peanut butter, like the sticky peanut butter that makes you feel good, it tastes good, whatever it is. And the kids who get peanuts or feel like they get peanuts, because my dad had his ways of giving me peanut butter. I didn't see it, right? They go out into the world and search for it from literally everybody. And so that was kind of my path. It's like marriage number 1 didn't work. Really messy relationship between marriage 1 and Chris. And then Chris, I think it worked in a lot of really great ways, but ultimately it's no longer. And then there were some things in between, and then there was Dave. And so it's kind of, that's been part of my journey. Unhealed wounds from dad have been me trying to figure out what love is, you know? And all along, it's not in getting it from someone else. It's figuring out how to get it from me.
When my son said this thing to me in this breathwork journey, after he said that, he said, Dad, are you proud of me? Mm. And I reciprocated and I said, son, if you're proud of you, then I'm proud of you, right? And I think there's this reframing has helped a lot because children from a very young age have a really strong barometer on what's right and what's wrong. Mm-hmm. They know, and we knew when we were kids. Yeah. And giving them the ability to choose for themselves what's right and what's wrong and whether or not they're proud of who they are, I think goes a long way because when the framing is always about, son, I'm proud of you. Yes. Without first asking, are you proud? Then when I forget to say it, or when we go through these seasons or these periods of time where I'm not filling him with peanut butter, it doesn't matter because he just knows that as long as he's proud, then I'm going to be proud, right? I
love that. I actually just got that. Now I know what you're saying. I need to start doing that with my kids. Because if you're proud, then I'm proud. If you're not proud, I'm not. Do you say then you're not proud?
Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah.
I'm going to use that.
What do you think the best thing about therapy is? I'm a huge advocate. I think even if your life is like perfect and you think you have no issues, you should do it, right?
I agree.
Like, what's been maybe the most special thing about doing therapy for you?
Oh, man, I mean, I've done therapy for so many years for so many different things. I was always the student who could lie to my therapist about my eating disorder. And like, I wanted to make the therapist proud. Isn't that funny?
Yeah, there you go.
So I'd be like, oh, shoot, I can't tell her I binged and purged. I mean, this is years ago.
Yeah.
So for forever, I was the person who would lie to her therapist to make the therapist proud, which the therapist is like just there to collect a check. So what was I doing?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to say this. I see a therapist. I have a life coach, and I do my own like healing journeys, oftentimes breath work. Sometimes there's plant-based medicine, whatever it is. I think they all have a very different benefit for me. So therapy, for example, I don't see my therapist every week. At some points I have. But I've been seeing the same one on and off since I was married to Chris. We had seen her together, and I really love that. She is she's a psychologist. She's really highly educated. She knows me very well. And in therapy, I feel like I get from the right therapist, I get very real, honest feedback on the blind spots that I have. And I need that. Like, I know that I need that. I'm not someone who's like, I'm going to surround myself with people who tell me what I want to hear. I want to be around people that I trust, number one, and who are going to tell me what I need to hear. So Laurel is amazing. She is so good at pointing out my blind spots.
Like you're flat, for example.
Yeah.
Totally agree.
I mean, but with relationships, believe it or not, even though I've had messy relationships, she's been so wonderful at like, she can call a relationship from like the first couple weeks of me talking to her about it. She's like, here's how this is going to end. I'm like, no, you don't know. And I still don't listen. I still have to live it. And guess what? They end the way she says they're going to because of red flags that she saw in the partner that I never saw. You know, so I love it because I don't always listen. And I don't think we're meant to always listen to a therapist, but I hear her. And then when I travel my path, I can say, oh my gosh, now I see what she was talking about here. Now I see what she was talking about here. It's kind of like a parent, right? Like with our parents, they gave us all the answers, but we're like, yeah. And then when we lived our life, we're like, now I know what mom was talking about here, or now I know what dad meant here. So that's kind of a therapist for me.
Yeah.
A life coach doesn't give advice. Mine doesn't give me any advice. She gives me a framework to create and utilize tools that help me with my own life. I love it. I love it for a very different reason. Like I go in to learn with her and I come out with tools that I then use in my life that week. Really awesome. And I highly recommend it for many people. Maybe not everyone. You have to be ready. Now, the other stuff, whether it's a breath work session beyond an hour can actually become a psychedelic experience, which is probably what you're talking about with your son.
Yeah.
And it's the most magical thing. I always go in with an intention. And the intention's fulfilled, but usually not the way that I think it's going to be fulfilled. So usually that intention's fulfilled, but the lesson that is brought to me, because that's what that is for me, in breath work or plant-based medicine, there is a lesson that is brought directly to me that I needed, that I didn't even know that I needed, right? Like I remember one time, for example, my lesson, this was after my anxiety, as I was kind of finally getting back on a better track. And I had done this amazing breathwork session. And it was one of the first times I'd ever experienced breathwork. And consequences was my teacher. It was this whole idea that like every single action, every single thing we do has a consequence. Sometimes the consequence is good. Sometimes it's bad. I don't want to use good and bad. Sometimes it's favorable and not painful, right? And sometimes that consequence hurts. And I was very aware of consequences of my actions, whether good or bad throughout my life. And I was very aware in that moment of things in my life that I would experience hard consequences for if I didn't change it, right? And yeah, it was awesome. And I actually felt like, I don't know if I told you the story, but there was like a death cloud that I felt in this particular experience. I don't even, like, I knew I was experiencing or feeling death in that moment. And I had actually told Dave about it. I said, I think I'm going to die, because I had just had my anxiety attacks.
I do remember this, yeah.
I think I'm going to die. And he's like, no, you're not going to die. And I was just crying, telling him. And I said, we're going to experience a soul death, you and I. I know it. I felt it. I know it. Like, I lived it. And I think it's soon. I thought it was like in the next couple of weeks, because I was after anxiety. I just felt it. I thought it was me. And interestingly, and I told him all about the consequences that I had seen and whatever. And Dave ended up dying. And it was hard to know that it was a consequence for some of his choices that I don't think he would have made if he knew the outcome, you know?
Yeah. One thing I really appreciate about you is I think everybody has an incredible amount of depth to them. All humans, regardless of their age or upbringing, everybody has depth, but most people really struggle articulating the amount of depth that they've had in their life. And one of the reasons I love having conversations with you is because there's depth, but you're really good at articulating it and going to that place, and you've gotten really comfortable doing that. So thank you for sharing that today with the audience. So we're going to close here. The way that I want to close is I want you to look into your camera, which is this one here over my shoulder. And I want you to share a word of advice specifically for women that are struggling to love themselves, because I think that there's a lot of them.
Yeah.
And it's heartbreaking, and specifically young women.
Yeah.
So what would you say?
I'm going to say to you what I think I needed to hear a long time ago, and something that I know now and I have to remind myself of often. And that is that every single thing that you are currently going through, like all of the stuff, all of the really hard, painful, yucky stuff that might be the result of what you did because you didn't love who you are, all of the pain, all of the hopelessness, all of the fear that you have inside of you right now is exactly what it needs to be to get you to the other side. I think so often we, and probably you, judge yourself for every action. You judge yourself for how you feel. You judge yourself because you're not far enough along in life, whatever it is. And I fully believe that every single thing happens for a reason. You are where you're at right now because there's a lesson inside of it that you are meant to learn to get you to the place where you love who you are. But I think you also should start playing around with trusting yourself, because I didn't trust myself for most of my life. And I asked everyone else's opinions because they were more right than I were, or so I thought. But the more you play around with not asking the opinions of other people, and you play around with asking yourself your opinion and trusting that, the more comfortable you will be with making decisions that you are proud of, which is something obviously we've talked a lot about today. And I know for me, self-love actually came when I could say that I was proud of myself. So you're where you need to be. And I promise you, you're going to be okay. You just need to trust the process. And I love you.
Thank you for joining the Roller Coaster Podcast, Heidi. That's a wrap.
Thank you.